The first time my own board ever raised their voices at me, it wasn't because of a bad quarter. It was because I said one sentence out loud. I'm not partnering with him. The room went quiet in that expensive, polished way, like everyone had rehearsed being shocked. Then the chair smiled and told me calmly that if I didn't sign the partnership agreement by Friday, they'd protect the company from instability. Translation, they'd replace me in the company I built. And the worst part? They genuinely believed they were saving us. They had no idea who their chosen man really was, or what I already knew about him. I'm a CEO now, but I wasn't born into boardrooms. I built my company from a co-working desk and a dying laptop, then spent years turning it into something stable enough to hire people with mortgages and kids. We weren't some flashy unicorn. We were boring in the best way. B2B, long-term contracts, predictable revenue. The kind of business that doesn't make headlines because it actually works, which is why the crisis hit like a stomach punch. It started with a banking email on a Tuesday morning, a routine review of our revolving credit line. Harmless wording, but the subtext was clear to anyone who's ever watched a bank change its tone. By Thursday, they froze new draws. By Monday, our account manager, someone who'd been sending me Christmas cards, was suddenly no longer on the relationship. That's how it goes. One day you're a partner, the next day you're a risk. The board called an emergency meeting. The same afternoon, the bank freeze became real. 9 people in a glass conference room that smelled like citrus cleaner and stress. 2 of them were founders with me, but they'd mostly cashed out years ago. The rest were investors and independent directors, the kind who speak in calm, neutral phrases because it makes everything sound reasonable. They laid it out like a medical diagnosis. Short-term liquidity issue, credit facility uncertainty, vendor exposure, payroll risk. They used the word temporary a lot, like repeating it would make it true. Then they introduced their solution. His name was Mason Hale. That was the first moment my throat tightened, not from fear, but from recognition. The board members said his name like they were unveiling a secret weapon. Mason apparently had relationships with alternative lenders, access to strategic clients, and a track record of turning chaos into leverage. They called him a fixer. They called him a partner. They said he'd come in as strategic operating partner, with performance-based equity and authority, commensurate with the task. I called it what it was, a forced marriage. I asked the obvious questions. Why him? Why now? Why does he need equity and decision rights to make introductions? Why does the term sheet give him access to internal reporting and vendor contracts? Why is the board rushing this in 5 business days? The chair kept smiling. Because time kills companies, and Mason moves fast. I looked around the room and realized something that made my skin go cold. They weren't debating. They were presenting. The vote had already happened somewhere without me. They'd already invited him to the building. When Mason walked in, he didn't look like a villain. That's the trick. He looked like someone you'd trust with a key card. Mid-30s, clean haircut, tailored suit that didn't scream, trying too hard. He shook hands like he was collecting them. He remembered first names instantly. He made a joke about the coffee being better than most crisis rooms, and people laughed because they needed permission to breathe. Then he looked at me. Just for a second, his smile hesitated, like a reflex he couldn't fully control. He recovered immediately, but I saw it. Recognition, mutual and unwelcome. Years ago, before I had a board, before I even had a payroll, I'd worked in a smaller firm that got advised into a deal with a charismatic consultant. The deal looked brilliant on paper. It destroyed the company in 6 months. People lost jobs. The owners got sued, and the consultant disappeared the moment the money moved. The name on the emails back then wasn't Mason Hale, but I remembered the face. I remembered the voice. I remembered the way he'd made everyone feel stupid for hesitating. I also remembered something else. A folder I kept because I'm paranoid in the way you only become after you've been burned. Old invoices, a signed engagement letter, A chain of emails where he'd pushed certain decisions in writing. Proof that he hadn't just been around, he'd been the one steering the wheel. Back in the conference room, Mason took a seat like it belonged to him. He clicked his pen. "First, I want to say I respect what you've built," he said, looking at me like we were allies. "I'm not here to take over. I'm here to keep the lights on." One of the directors nodded like she'd been waiting all day to hear that line. Mason continued, smooth and patient. "There are two realities here. One, the bank is spooked, and spooked banks don't calm down because you send them a nice spreadsheet. Two, your biggest clients are going to hear about this before you want them to. Not because anyone here is leaking, just because that's how markets work. My job is to get in front of that." My board ate it up. I didn't. Not because I'm smarter than everyone else. Because I'd heard this exact cadence before. The same gentle urgency. The same implied threat. Cooperate with me or the world will punish you. I tried, once, to slow it down. "I'm not comfortable giving an external partner access to internal pricing and contracts," I said. "If he's introducing lenders, we can do that through counsel with a limited scope." Mason didn't argue with me. He looked at the board instead, like I was a well-meaning employee who didn't understand strategy. The chair spoke for him. "We can't hamstring the person we're hiring to fix this," I asked. "Hiring? Or replacing me?" That's when the room changed. One director cleared his throat. Another stared at the table like it had answers printed on the wood. The chair leaned in. "No one is replacing you," he said. "But we do have a duty. If you can't do what's necessary to stabilize the company, we will." It wasn't a threat delivered with anger. It was worse. It was delivered like a policy. Mason finally looked back at me, soft smile intact. "I get it," he said quietly. "This feels personal. It's not. It's math." I wanted to tell them the truth right there, that their savior had a history, that I'd seen him ruin a business from the inside, that the last place he helped didn't survive him. But I didn't, because saying it without preparation would make me sound desperate. And in a room full of people who already decided you're the problem, desperation is just confirmation. So I nodded. I asked for the agreement. I asked for 48 hours to review with counsel. I thanked them like I wasn't swallowing glass. Mason stood up to leave, and as he passed behind my chair, he leaned in just enough that no one else could hear. "Good to see you again," he murmured, voice warm like we were old friends. "I wondered when you'd end up in a room like this." Then he walked out, and the board kept talking about timelines and signatures, like they hadn't just invited a match into a dry forest. I went back to my office, shut the door, and opened that old folder on my laptop with hands that didn't shake, because shaking is what happens when you don't have a plan yet. And I did have a plan, not a heroic one, not a dramatic one, a real one. Because if my board wanted to gamble the company on their chosen man, I was going to make sure the truth didn't stay hidden behind his smile. By the end of the first week, it stopped feeling like my company. That wasn't a metaphor. It was operational. Mason didn't waste time. He never does. Within 48 hours of the board approving collaboration, he had a temporary badge, a company email, and a standing invite to meetings I'd never missed in 5 years. The board framed it as efficiency. I recognized it as displacement. He started with harmless things, or things that look harmless if you don't know how control actually works. "Let's tighten reporting," he suggested in our first joint ops call. "Daily cash snapshots, vendor aging, client concentration by revenue dependency. All reasonable, all things we already tracked, just not in a format that handed leverage to an outsider." He asked for raw exports instead of summaries. He asked for shared folders instead of read-only decks. He asked for temporary access to pricing models so he could speak confidently with lenders. The board backed him every time. When I pushed back, even gently, it was noted, not argued with, just logged in that quiet way professionals use when they're building a narrative. He's being protective. He's emotionally close to the business. He might not be thinking clearly under pressure. That last one stung because it was delivered with concern. Mason, meanwhile, played the role perfectly. He never contradicted me in public, he just reframed. If I said, "We should slow down this vendor renegotiation," he'd say, "I hear that, but speed signals, strength to creditors." If I flagged risk, he called it legacy caution. If I asked for legal review, he sighed and said, "I'm worried the lawyers will kill momentum." And somehow momentum became the only thing that mattered. What bothered me most wasn't the access. It was the tone shift. People stopped coming to me first. Our head of sales, someone I'd hired personally, started CCing Mason on updates that had nothing to do with financing. Ops began looping him in on vendor disputes. HR asked whether Mason should weigh in on a hiring freeze I'd already approved. It was subtle. Nobody announced it. But authority leaks the way water does through the smallest cracks. The board noticed. They liked it. At the next meeting, the chair praised Mason's decisiveness and contrasted it, unintentionally I think, with my deliberative style. One director joked that Mason was what you get when you mix urgency with confidence. I didn't laugh, because I could see what Mason was actually doing. He wasn't fixing the crisis, he was reframing it. He started telling people we weren't just dealing with a liquidity hiccup. We were facing a credibility event. That phrase showed up everywhere after he used it once. Credibility event, as if the company's fundamentals had failed, not the timing of a credit review. As if leadership had stumbled, not the bank. That framing justified everything that followed. He pushed for accelerated client conversations, not to reassure them, but to test who'd panic. He encouraged procurement to pressure test long-term vendors, knowing full well which ones would push back. He asked finance to model scenarios that assumed partial client loss, then circulated them as if they were probabilities, not stress tests. People started acting afraid, and fear is useful if you're trying to make yourself indispensable. I spent those weeks doing two things at once. Publicly, I complied. I signed off on access requests after narrowing scope just enough to look cooperative. I let Mason attend meetings as long as counsel was present. I stopped objecting in the room and started asking questions afterward, one-on-one, where words don't get weaponized as easily. Privately, I documented everything, every access request, every email where Mason implied authority he didn't yet have, every board message that suggested outcomes before votes. I worked with our general counsel, not as a panicked CEO, but as someone planning for a governance audit that might never happen. I asked questions framed as hypotheticals. What constitutes undue influence? When does advisory cross into control? How do you document coercion without accusing? He answered carefully, but he answered. And then there was the lender. Mason claimed he had one lined up, a private credit fund willing to step in fast, no bank bureaucracy. He dropped their name casually, like it was already done, said they understood situations like ours. He told the board he'd done deals with them before. I asked for an intro. Days passed. No email, no call. When I pressed again, Mason smiled and said, "They move when the story's clean. Right now, they're watching how aligned leadership is." Aligned, another word that suddenly mattered a lot. That's when I realized the timeline wasn't about funding at all. It was about conditioning. The board needed to see me bend. Mason needed to see where I'd break. And the company needed to feel unstable enough that any solution, even a bad one, would feel like relief. I didn't break. I stopped sleeping well. I stopped trusting the room. But I didn't break. Instead, I made one decision that changed the temperature of everything. I authorized a parallel funding conversation, quietly through counsel, with a regional institution that knew our history and had no appetite for theatrics. No board announcement, no decks, just facts, financials, and a question. If we restructure the line with tighter covenants, are you interested? They were. Not committed, interested, which was enough. I didn't tell Mason, I didn't tell the board. I just kept building options while they congratulated themselves on progress that existed mostly in PowerPoint. And then one afternoon, I was copied on an email I wasn't meant to see. It was short, sent from Mason to 2 board members. Not all, just 2. Once the new facility is in motion, he wrote, we should revisit leadership structure. Investors will want clarity. That was it. No drama, no explanation. Just a sentence that confirmed everything I'd suspected. I didn't know it yet, but that decision, to put it in writing, would cost them everything. The unraveling didn't happen all at once. It never does. It started with timing. Mason finally scheduled the lender call on a Thursday afternoon, deliberately overlapping with our monthly operating review. He framed it as unavoidable. These guys don't wait, and the board backed him without hesitation. I was expected to split my attention between defending performance internally and selling stability externally, while Mason ran point. That was the moment I stopped reacting and started executing. I agreed to the call. I let Mason lead. I watched carefully. The lender wasn't who Mason said they were. Not exactly. The firm existed, yes, but the partner on the call was junior, cautious, and clearly unfamiliar with our business. Mason spoke over him, filled silences too quickly, promised access and velocity that no serious credit shop would ever expect before diligence. When the partner asked about governance, specifically whether leadership changes were anticipated, Mason answered without looking at me. Alignment is in progress, he said. The board is unified. The partner nodded slowly, not convinced, just noting. After the call, Mason sent a summary email to the board within minutes. He described the lender as warm, the concerns as procedural, and the path forward as clear if we move decisively. He CC'd me last. I replied with one line, please include counsel on all future lender communications. Mason didn't respond, but one of the directors did privately. Is this really necessary? She wrote. We can't afford friction right now. I stared at that sentence for a long time. Then I forwarded it to our general counsel and asked him to log it. The pressure escalated after that. Mason began pushing for interim authority. Nothing formal, just practical. Signature delegation for vendor renegotiations. Temporary oversight on finance approvals. To avoid mixed messaging, he framed it as protecting me from stress. The board framed it as support. I framed it as the line. I said no, not loudly, not emotionally, just no with reasons. Legal reasons, fiduciary reasons, reasons that sounded boring enough to be unarguable. That's when the tone shifted. Suddenly, Mason wasn't collaborative anymore. He was impatient. He started scheduling meetings without me, then summarizing them afterward. He used phrases like, we decided, when he meant, I suggested. He began referring to me in the third person during discussions I was sitting in. One afternoon, I walked into a conference room and found Mason already at the head of the table, my seat taken. No one moved. I didn't either. I sat somewhere else and let it happen. Because chaos is loud, but documentation is quiet. The real mistake came a week later. Mason pushed through a vendor renegotiation with one of our largest infrastructure providers. Something I'd explicitly said required legal review. He justified it as time-sensitive. He copied the board. He didn't copy counsel. The vendor replied all. They declined. Politely. But in doing so, they referenced a side conversation Mason had apparently had with them. One where he'd implied a change in control was imminent, and that pricing would be revisited post-transition. Post-transition. That email landed in my inbox at 7:42 a.m. By 8:10, our general counsel was in my office with the door closed. By 9, I had enough. We moved quickly, not dramatically, but decisively. Council triggered a formal governance review under provisions most board members had never bothered to read. An independent firm was retained, not to accuse, just to assess. Access logs were preserved, communications archived, meeting minutes frozen. At the same time, I advanced the parallel funding conversation I'd been nurturing quietly. The regional institution had finished diligence faster than expected. They weren't flashy. They weren't cheap, but they were real. They issued a conditional term sheet that morning. I didn't circulate it. Instead, I called an emergency board meeting for the following day. No agenda beyond company stability update. Everyone showed up. Mason arrived confident. He thought this was the moment where pressure would finally force my hand. The room was tense. No small talk. No jokes about coffee. I started by speaking plainly. I outlined the operational status, cash position, vendor exposure, payroll runway, calm, factual. Then I handed it to counsel. He didn't accuse anyone. He didn't need to. He walked through governance boundaries, advisory versus control, influence versus authority. He cited emails, meeting notes, the vendor exchange. No commentary, just facts. Then he paused. At this time, he said, we are recommending that all non-officer access be suspended pending review. Mason laughed. Actually laughed. This is overkill, he said, looking around the room. We're trying to save the company, and you're lawyering yourselves into paralysis. No one joined him. I slid one document across the table. The term sheet. This is a committed path to liquidity, I said. No equity. No control transfer. Tight covenants, yes, but temporary. Council has reviewed. It's executable. The chair looked stunned. Why are we seeing this now? Because until now, I said, it wasn't safe to share. Silence followed, the kind that means something's gone wrong. Mason stood up slowly. If you move forward with that, he said, you're undermining everything we've built. I met his eyes. You mean everything you planned? That's when the board finally understood. Not emotionally, structurally. They saw the pattern, the access, the pressure, the emails, the timing. They saw that the chaos hadn't been the crisis. It had been the strategy. Mason left the room first. He didn't slam the door. He didn't argue. He just walked out, already calculating his next version of the story. But this time, it wouldn't be ours. The aftermath was quieter than I expected. No shouting, no dramatic exits, just consequences moving through a system that suddenly remembered how rules work. The board reconvened without Mason 2 hours later. Counsel remained. So did the independent firm. The tone wasn't accusatory anymore. It was procedural, which is how real damage control actually sounds. Questions were asked that had nothing to do with feelings and everything to do with exposure. Who authorized access? Who introduced Mason? Who communicated with him outside formal meetings? Who knew about the post-transition language before it appeared in writing? 2 directors went very still during that part. By the end of the day, Mason's credentials were revoked. His email was disabled. Security was instructed, politely, professionally, not to issue him a visitor badge again. No announcement was made. He simply stopped existing inside the company. The next morning, the bank called, not to threaten, to clarify. Word had reached them, through channels I didn't control, that we were restructuring governance and stabilizing liquidity. They wanted updated documentation. They wanted reassurance. They wanted to know who was actually in charge. For the first time in weeks, I answered without rehearsing. We closed the regional facility 3 days later. Covenants were tight, exactly as expected. Weekly reporting, board oversight, 0 surprises, payroll cleared. Vendors calmed down, clients never panicked. Because fear, it turns out, doesn't spread when no one feeds it. The credibility event vanished the moment we stopped performing it. The investigation concluded faster than anyone predicted. No crimes, nothing cinematic. Just breaches of duty, conflicts of interest, and conduct that made insurers nervous. That's all it takes. 1 director resigned for personal reasons. Another was removed in a special vote after counsel explained, very calmly, how discovery would work if they didn't. No one defended them. People rarely do when the risk becomes personal. As for Mason, his story collapsed on contact with reality. The lender he'd promised couldn't proceed without authority he didn't have. The vendors he'd leaned on corrected the record. The board members who'd been friendly stopped returning his calls. By the end of the month, his name was being spoken the way professionals speak about liabilities, briefly and only when necessary. I never confronted him again. I didn't need to. The company stabilized, then it recovered. Not perfectly, not instantly, but honestly. We rehired one role we'd frozen. We renewed 2 contracts that had felt uncertain. The building stopped humming with anxiety, and something else happened, slowly. People started coming back to my office first, not because I demanded it, because authority, once it's stripped down to reality, tends to return to the person who never tried to fake it. At the next board meeting, the chair asked if I wanted to revisit governance structure. More independence, more checks, less improvisation. I said yes. Because the lesson wasn't that I'd survived an attempted takeover. It was that I'd let proximity replace preparation once before, and I wouldn't do it again. They thought forcing me to partner with their chosen man would save the company. What actually saved it was understanding that power doesn't announce itself when it's dangerous. It smiles. It reassures. It says it's here to help. And the moment you stop mistaking confidence for competence, everything gets very clear. I walked out of that meeting the same way I walked into the company years ago, without applause, without noise, without needing permission. The difference was this time no one tried to follow me out.